Hello boys and girls, I managed to do some PTR testing on the N+ dungeons that are currently available on the test realm. I played Restoration Shaman, Holy Paladin, Enhancement Shaman, Red Paladin, and now I'm going to share my first impressions from the dungeons that I managed to run several times. Most of my feedback is quite positive and everything felt quite good, but let's start with the bad first. Murozond's Rise in the Dawn of the Infinite. Now, to say this softly and mildly, I hate this place with passion. It is horrible. And the main reason is not the tuning. It does feel that this place is tuned much higher than the rest of the dungeons that I managed to play. But there are so many more reasons that just make me feel like I'm not going to be stepping foot in that place if it releases in the state it is currently right now. The first big issue that you're going to hit if you go there is the mini boss after the first boss. This fight is ridiculously hard, it is so much damage, it's unimaginable, and then you have to move constantly, which if you're a shaman healer, then good luck healing through all the incoming damage with the nerfed AoE healing abilities. But alright, let's say that this is a tuning issue. What follows next is the labyrinth with the shooting balls that you have to go through to click the orb on the other side to open a portal. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone wants to see that in the N+ dungeons at all. You're on a timer, you have to kill mobs, you have to kill bosses, but all you're doing is playing Frogger, which does seem to hit you unfairly and send you back into beginning in some occasions, and even if you make it at the end, you have to click and channel the orb for like how many seconds until everybody else can join you. Now, we'll probably get better as the season progresses, but it just feels bad for this to be in the scene, and it gets even worse because further in the dungeon, there are the flying dragons that carry you around, there's long running spaces that you have to go through, and even the RP at the end, which we were promised is going to be shortened, and I think it's shortened, it still feels way too long. Then you add the trash after the labyrinth where you have to clear the scent in the room. This one is horrible, it's horribly tuned, and even the portals that you use to teleport do not work as intended all the time. And even if they tune the damage of the small mobs exploding, it still feels quite slow and quite cumbersome to go through the area and clear all the sand. And then you get to the fun bosses. The one where you fight the Alliance guy. This one could be fixed with some tuning, although right now it's ridiculous. If he starts spinning and you're inside of the circle and you don't have any movement abilities, you're dead because it's way too fast and you just can't get out of it. And then I guess it's intended, but everything gets pretty chaotic when he summons the ad. The mage just keeps spamming you with firebolts, which leave a nasty dot if they hit you. There is a bleed that I think it's left by the hunter. At the same time, the boss keeps spamming frontals at you and has an AoE shout that damages everyone. And at the end of the day, this one felt pretty bad, especially if you're melee. I would assume though that with little tuning and a lot of practice, we're going to get better at it and it's not going to be the worst part of the dungeon. However, Morchi is as bad as you would imagine it's going to be. I am definitely not looking forward to this fight in pugs and probably even in coordinated teams. The part where you have to find the true Morchi when she goes around the room, well, if they have a weak word that solves this, then this is basically not a mechanic, and if they don't, you have to pray that you're lucky enough to find it quickly, otherwise you're just dead by the frontal. Later on, when the ads come and you have to lead them to the traps, if everybody does it at the same time, you're dead because it's just way too much damage, and at the same time as a healer, if you're trying to heal everybody, they're probably at the other end of the room and they're out of range. And all of that is even without mentioning the last boss, which was manageable. But the TLDR is, this place felt horrible. I have no words to explain how bad the experience was. I went there a few times. We managed to clear it at a +20 for 89 minutes, when we managed to basically 2-chest other 21s. So I think it's quite obvious this place needs a lot of work, but I'm very afraid the tuning is not going to be enough, because there are a lot of other parts in the dungeon which are quite unpleasant, but it's not because of tuning, it's just because of the design. At the end, I'm definitely not holding my breath for this one. I hope it's playable, but I'm not an optimist. We shall wait and see, and if I'm to give a mark to this one, wherever the lowest mark is, I'm going to give it even lower than that. Alright, now that we got the black sheep out of the way, the next is Galakrond's Fall, which is the other part of the Dawn of the Infinite dungeon. We did manage to time this and a +20 with Fortified and Tyrannical affixes at the same time. This one was also relatively harder compared to the rest of the dungeons in terms of tuning, but it was not ridiculously hard as the Merchant's Rise was. Most of the trash and the bosses are actually quite interesting and everything felt relatively fair, apart maybe from the Blight of Garaklon's boss fight, which at least personally to me was the hardest part of the dungeon. Also compared to the other part of the dungeon, the flying on the dragons here is much less, and also you don't have the stupid labyrinth to go through. So at the end of the day, the journey here felt quite nice, although we had a lot of unfamiliar mechanics and a lot of things to learn. But I actually enjoyed that, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing this dungeon in N+. It's also worth noting that there are a lot of mechanics in this dungeon, not only for the trash but for the bosses as well. Different phases, different frontals, shields that you have to go into, souls that you have to perform. So overall we're going to have a blast in here unless they do some ridiculously bad tuning. The other 4 dungeons that I managed to test, all of them felt relatively easier compared to the Dawn of the Infinite ones. Maybe it's tuning and that of course will be fixed, maybe it's because people run them back in the day and they knew the mechanics. But for example, we managed to 2-chest a plus 21 way quest manor, which at this point shapes to be probably the easiest of all the dungeons, but that could easily change with few tuning fixes. The first things to mention here is that all the doors in the mansions are open, which means that you can pick whatever route you want. Now that also means that people are probably going to figure out the best route and you're not going to see half of the trash in the whole dungeon probably, because you'll never have to go, for example, in the 2nd floor of the mansion. But I don't think that's going to be a problem because there's plenty of mobs here, different trash, different mechanics, so missing on some of it is not going to be the end of the world. The trash could be quite nasty. I had several tanks saying, okay, after the 3 boss I'm going to run in there, pull all the mobs and run out. They all died. So expect a lot of fun moments in there, and there's also 5 bosses, so keep that in mind. I think that this dungeon is actually going to be quite challenging on tyrannical weeks because the bosses have different mechanics and they're not easy by any means. I also saw a few changes from the original dungeon, which I didn't play that much anyway, but I think the edges from some of the witches were interruptible, and they are not right now. But at the end of the day, this also shapes up to be a quite fun dungeon, and I'm also looking forward to playing this again in N+. You can actually watch most of those runs uploaded on my channel, but you're probably not going to find anything about Ataldazar there, and the reason is that I've run this dungeon so many times on the PTR, but I don't think there was a single instance where I managed to finish the whole dungeon without crashing the game at least once, disconnecting or something like that. We even had the boss with the totems not activate, for instance Alunzma just disconnecting everybody at the same time. I guess pretty normal things for the PTR, that's why we're testing, so there's nothing I should be worried about because I'm pretty sure all of this will be fixed by the time we get the release. As for the dungeon itself, it's actually quite fun, the bosses are interesting, and the trash has changed a little bit. Some particular mobs have been removed to make some of the packs easier so you don't have to skip them every time. There's an ongoing discussion whether or not the snapping is going to be a thing in this dungeon, which is very important for the small bats that you're going to see in some of the next sections. You also have different pathing options to which boss to go first, to which boss to go last, and there are different options of the trash pack that you can pick to get to the 100% trash count, so overall this shapes up to be a very fun dungeon at the end. And of course, depending on the tuning, it should be one of the hard dungeons this upcoming season. Next up we have the 2 Legend N+ dungeons, and I've done this only once probably during Legend N+ time walking, so I was quite unexperienced, everything was new to me, which was very interesting, but somehow we did manage to time both of them on plus 20, and that makes me think that maybe the tuning is not going to be what we're going to see at the end, but it's still early days, so we'll talk about that more when the release date approaches. Dark Heart Ticket felt just about right. There were a few trash packs which felt extremely hard and extremely difficult for some reason. It could have been that we just didn't know the mechanics, and we might have had a couple of wipes in there. So I can easily see this dungeon being extremely difficult if they crank up the tuning a little bit. But overall, I like the place, I like the trash mechanics that I still have to learn most of them. And the bosses were also very interesting. We didn't have tyrannical affix in this run. And the people in my pug were actually quite experienced and knew a lot about the dungeon. So the fights didn't feel that difficult, but maybe that's the reason. But I don't think that this dungeon will have something that is very unpleasant to play with like let's say we had in Udaman. So I'm definitely an optimist for this one, and I'm also looking forward to playing it in N+. Lastly, we have Blackroot Code, which we played without affixes, so I guess everything was a tiny bit easier than expected. We also had a few bugs with disconnects, we died on the last boss and we couldn't release, so I had to ank and res everybody up. All things that eventually will get fixed. However, I will say that I remember the Ilisana's fight to be very hard on the M+ time locking in Legion, and nowadays it just felt so much easier compared to what I had to experience before. So that makes me a bit careful talking about this dungeon, because I think we're going to see a lot of tuning changes specifically for this one, and it could end up being one of the hardest dungeons this season. Even with this tuning and no affixes, we had quite a few problems with some of the trash, a lot of things to interrupt, a lot of things to stun, many frontals that just wipe people off of the map, and the hardest part were the rolling stones on the stairs that you had to go up to stop them. Those actually one-shot people, which was hilarious. I think we had like the total of 6 or 7 deaths just on that part of the dungeon. And although losing people there could be a bit obnoxious, it's not as bad as the dungeon and the maze in the Murzan's Rise. This one is much shorter, much easier, and once you get to the top, the stones just stop falling and everybody can safely pass through without you having to channel an orb or some other kind of stupidity that they can come up with. Again, the bosses felt a little bit of undertuned, but also keep in mind that it was not tyrannical and there's still mechanics that can one-shot you, especially on the last boss. So I'm definitely expecting this to be one of the more challenging dungeons once the season is released. So that's all I have for you right now. There's 2 more dungeons we have to test, but they're not released on the PTR yet. Once they're there, I'll do some runs and I'll probably upload them in my channel so you can watch the runs. As many of the runs that you can see on the footage of this video, you can already see uploaded in the channel. So that's it for this video. Let me know what you think about the dungeons. Do you have any experience running them on the PTR or maybe from back in the day? What are your expectations for Season 3? I'll see you in the next video. Until then, happy healing and take care.